Welcome to The State of Us.
Beyond mainstream cable news and party lines, with a millennial and a boomer, The State of Us pushes past the noise and uncovers all the issues that matter.
Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Recent data shows that there may be strong biological reasons that girls spend more time on social media and boys spend more time playing video games. How does this fit with breaking down gender norms like we've talked about before on The State of Us? And how do the generations, millennials, boomers, Gen X, Gen Z, how do they look at these issues differently? Those are some of the questions that we're going to examine in today's show, but this is inevitably something that affects all of us, society as a whole, where we work, how we live, how we interact with one another. The very nature of these studies speak a lot to who we are as people and also how we view them and how critical we are of them. But of course, we couldn't begin a conversation on social media, video games, and gender norms without
TrueChat senior historian and an educator of more than 30 years. Here is your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
Well, this is a topic I've always been interested in, being a teacher, watching how young men and young ladies respond to different things in the classroom, and then raising two daughters of my own in a society where I did not want them to feel like they were limited with what they could do, and trying to do my best, do our best to open their minds to the ability to do whatever they want to do. So this is, when you say, why do you care? This is, I think this is something everybody should care about. Who either works with young people or comes in contact with young people, either as a parent or an aunt, an uncle, grandma, grandpa. We want to, I would hope, let them know that the opportunities that they have are endless. So, but they can approach it in different ways.
And I think it's important to kick this off too, Lance, by making sure that we explain to people we're going to do the best we can in this episode to talk about this. And Lance and I, of course, are limited by our own experiences and being able to talk about this, but we're also going to do our best. We're not trying to offend anybody in today's episode. So just keep that in mind as we're going. If you take offense to something that we say or you disagree with it, you know that we welcome that disagreement. That's part of what we're trying to do here. But also keep in mind that we're trying to look at the data. We're trying to give you our thoughts. So just bear in mind that we're probably not going to use the perfect terminology all the time. And part of that's because some of it doesn't exist. And that's a little bit what Lance and I were discussing before the show, is a lot of what Lance brought up, making sure that his girls had the same opportunities, that everybody had. That, I think, deals with a lot of what we've talked about before on The State of Us, Lance, which is gender equality, right? This idea of the same opportunities, the same career paths, the same ability to have a good life is bestowed, the ability to be paid the same, right? That's kind of what we mean when we're talking about gender equality. And we're going to talk some about that today because inevitably that is part of this conversation. But we're also going to be talking about, for lack of a better term, gender views, how we perceive gender. And what that means in today's society, because that's where you get into there's differences in gender equality views from generation to generation, but there's also that difference in what is gender in the first place. And that's part of what makes this conversation kind of complicated, I think, for some people to have, is understanding that those aren't necessarily one and the same. Right.
And where I was coming from is I wanted to make sure that they didn't fall into any gender role or societal role for gender, so I'll throw the word role in there as well. And again, just searching for the proper vocabulary. I wanted them to feel free to climb mountains or open a daycare center or build tall buildings or run for political office or do whatever they wanted to do, and not feel like, because of society's outlook, well, your gender says you should do this, this, or this. I wanted them to feel free that they were a human being and they could do anything they wanted to do if they worked at it and they had an inclination to it and they had an interest in it.
Right. So let's talk a little bit, Lance. Now we're turning to the Wall Street Journal article. There's a couple different things we're going to reference today, but of course they're all linked at thestateofus.org as always. And the thing, Lance actually flagged this article for us, so he gets the credit or the blame depending on your perspective here. But one of the things it mentions is, according to a 2017 survey conducted by Pew Research Center, 41% of teenage boys said they spend too much time playing video games, while only 11% of girls do. Conversely, data from Pew also shows that in general, women use social platforms far more than men, according to a social psychologist at Stanford University. The interesting thing here, because again, here's something that could be coming into play, as people are going to be saying, well, that reinforces gender roles or gender norms or what have you. We're going to talk a little bit about that in the third segment, but this data is based on studying using FMRIs, which, if you're not familiar with, is basically sort of like real-time scans of the brain. So we can have somebody playing a video game, right? Girls and boys, and we can measure which parts of the brain light up as a result. And we can have boys and girls use social media and measure which part of the brains light up and how much. So that's what this is all based on, this research that we're talking about, just so that we're clear with people. But interesting that that's how those manifest, Lance.
Men are from Mars and women are from Venus. I mean, the brains work differently, and that's a good thing because it enables us then to have a complete and whole society. One thing about that, those stats I found really interesting, I just jotted that down, is 59% or almost 60% of males don't think they play too many video games, too much time. And, almost 90% of females don't think they play too much video games. So the majority obviously feel like they're playing just the right amount of video games.
The point here to me is that part of what the data told us is that especially when males go off to college, they can struggle with that time balance of when to stop playing video games, when to unplug and get back to schoolwork. And on the female side, they struggle with how much time they're spending on social media versus schoolwork, right? And that regulation again when they're out of the home. So really, I think to your point, the core struggle is not all that different. We have these vices, right? And we are succumbing to those vices or not. We're trying to figure out how to balance these things. And it just is it's a manifestation differently based on what lights up the reward centers in the respective biological brains of your stereotypical males and females.
Exactly. I mean, that's exactly it, because as you point out, is there really a difference as far as the outcome of my success if I'm spending too much time gaming or I'm spending too much time on Pinterest? The bottom line is the same. Am I giving myself enough time to do my studies or to do my job so that I can be successful? It's just that one group more than the other, but the bottom line is the problem is the same, controlling that vice.
Right, exactly. Well, and that's a little bit too about what we'll talk in the third segment of today's program is, well, what do we do with all this information that we're talking about? Because some of it's interesting, but we want it to be actionable too, in the sense that from a societal standpoint, how we're looking at these things, but also from the internal standpoint of recognizing the hurdles that we will all probably face, albeit in different ways, but that are definitely going to be there. Because I was thinking about, Lance, I don't play video games super often. I play definitely more in the winter months than I do, the rest of the year. But
and part of that has to do with your outdoor environment.
Exactly.
You might not play at all if you lived in an environment where it was warm and nice year round. But here where we live, we get 4 or 5 months where it's just not too much fun to be outside for very long periods of time. Exactly.
Well, but as I was reflecting on this before the show, I was thinking about, why do I do this? It's because there's that time, right? That the outdoors aren't as available, and I spend a good bit of time, or try to, outside during the nice months. So it's partly that I'm filling that. But the other thing that's interesting is when I play, it tends to kind of become all consuming once I start like a new game, like it can become very hard to be productive at other things until I have accomplished whatever the arbitrary thing is to accomplish, whether that's, finish the game or finish a given mission or an objective or what have you. But it's very oriented toward pulling you in. And that might not be the same for everybody, but I just wanted to share that because I think that's the personal side of I really recognize that as something that I have to be careful of when I start something new like that.
So your personality trait, or one of them is you are goal oriented. And when the game gives you a goal of completing this level or completing this mission or whatever it is, you're not satisfied until you've reached that goal.
Right. Well, and I think that's part of what they discovered from the biological standpoint of those male brains, right? When presented with this, because it's and that's the interesting thing. The males aren't really setting, I mean, you kind of are, but the game is setting these, these checkpoints and these objectives and these goals for you. And it's saying, you're successful if you meet these things, that will be success. And I think that speaks to the reward center stereotypically that a lot of men have from a biological standpoint, where the socializing, right, and the connecting and keeping up with what's going on, the fear of missing out is fulfilled for women through social media. It's speaking to those biological reward centers that we're not making a judgment about which one's better or worse. It's just, again, that's the manifesting differently, not necessarily a different end result, but the manifestation and how we get to the end result is what might be different.
But still being goal-oriented for the females, because in the article, it talks about the daughter of one doctor she was comparing the doctor, the mom was comparing her two sons to her daughter, and her daughter was trying to limit her social media. And so she didn't feel like, even when she limited, she goes, I can't catch up, which to me is code. She still wasn't satisfied. She didn't reach her goal. Okay, I limited myself to a certain amount of time of social media each day, but I didn't win. I didn't catch up. Now, I'm not saying I'm right, but again, like you're saying, both parties are being goal-oriented. They're just being drawn in to their device through different manners.
And the goals are presented differently. And, in other words, for the males who are hedging toward the video games, the goals have kind of been laid out for them, and they feel the need because they've been laid out to accomplish them. And on that female side, we have this goal, right, of staying caught up and of knowing what's going on. But it's almost more of an internalized goal or a societal goal that's been presented, but again, presented differently, where for the males, a lot of it's more clear cut and laid out for them specifically in the game. And the social media side, it's more of, I know that I have these expectations to keep up with this stuff, and I've got to accomplish that goal, hence the not enough time to do it. So Lance and I could go on with this part for a while, but we've got to move on to the next bit, because we're going to look at gender versus sex. And what we mean by that is, we'll save it. We're going to tell you here in a second. But this is where the gender, quote unquote, spectrum here becomes of interest, because the way that generations view this ultimately determines a lot of things like gender stereotypes, norms, and what society expects from people. So to find out how should we think about or how can we approach gender versus sex, and based on the generation you're in, you'll have to keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
According to Forbes, a recent Fusion poll found that 50% of millennials, half of millennials, believe gender is actually a spectrum, and that some people fall outside of conventional categories. Another survey by GLAAD found that more than 1 in 10, 12% of millennials actually identify as gender nonconforming, meaning that they don't identify with the sex they were assigned at birth or a specific sex in general. This is what we hinted at in the last part. And I know that for a lot of people, because we have a pretty, I think, Lance, hopefully a pretty diverse audience, both male, female, old, young, and in between. Lance is a boomer. I'm a millennial. So we try to take into account that some of the things we talk about, we have to approach in certain ways to make sure that our audience understands why this matters. And the reason this matters, as I hinted at in the first segment, is because the way that we perceive the idea of gender, right? The way that we look at this has a lot to do with determining how we view what gender norms are, which is kind of what we talked about in the first segment. And we just did that episode, Lance, like 2 months ago or so. The challenges men face today, the challenges women face today, the household chores thing, and how millennials on average are a lot better about that division of work. And part of that might be because they don't view gender as much of a defining factor, maybe as other generations previously have, at least in recent history.
Well, and the old guy in me will say it's also because I did more things around the house when I was a parent than my father did, so that my millennial daughters saw that it was okay for the partners to be more equitable and for things to be split up outside of the gender roles. Like I did most of the cooking and most of the laundry. My wife did most of the cleaning. Why? Because I was more comfortable that way. And then you would say, well, why did I do that? Because that's the way I was brought up. That's the way my mother brought me up. That's the way my grandma brought me up, is that you do your fair share. Whereas, and no disrespect to my father, because he grew up in a time where his role was to go to work and work very, very hard and bring home the money. And even though my mom was working as well, both outside the home and inside the home, she was still expected to cook the dinner and do the laundry and those items. So yes, millennials are more open to it. But I just throw that out there as just as a thinking point. Is it because it was modeled for them to allow them then to take the next step with things?
Sure. Well, and I think that's always part of it, right? That gets lost in some of this is it's not as simple as any generation just deciding, right, that, oh, well, we're just going to be different now. Usually it's set up by one of two things or usually a combination of those things, either what's happening in the world, right, from a global standpoint, or how their parents and, who raised them, the individuals that raised them, how they kind of set the stage for those things. And I think in this instance, it's definitely a combination of both, because like Lance said, some of the data, and it's a little more nuanced that you have to pay attention to, tells us that, boomers, a lot of whom grew up, right, as the Vietnam War was going on, and a lot of them might even still be self-described hippies, so to speak. And I think that is important to understanding that for their time, right, they were moving the needle forward. And so some of that mindset, I think, is probably what gets transitioned down to the bulk of their children, which happen to be millennials. Millennials are, on the whole, mostly the children of boomers. So that kind of, and I think it's interesting because we often forget that when we talk about these things. Millennials didn't just wake up and have this epiphany. Part of it is they had some of these built-in hearing about their parents and how they grew up and how things were changing and the stuff that they were going through that was making society different. It's like, okay, we may not have to go through some of those same struggles, but we have a new set of things that we want to overcome and be revolutionary with. So it was more of I think that mindset modeling, right, that enables the next generation. You just said
it, being revolutionary instead of, as Richard Nixon coined it in the late 60s, the silent majority. instead of everybody just sitting there and doing what the government wanted them to do, my generation had those, as you term them, hippies, who would challenge that authority. And then we passed on that challenging of authority or authority/social norms, challenging just in general, onto our children, which then, as you pointed out, our children are able to take it one step further than we were.
Well, the other thing, Lance, that I think we have to look at in this is, you know, we're members of just two generations, and by no means do Lance and I speak on behalf of our entire generation.
Our generation. There are a lot of people out there that disagree with my point. Because when you started this segment, I'm going to say it anyway, but who cares? And I mean that with all due respect. And this is where you said at the beginning, we're not trying to offend anybody, because I know these terms and where people are and how they feel are very, very important to them. My point when I say who cares is, why does it matter? Why can't we just care about one another as all being parts of the human race, of all being human, and not worrying about using the proper pronouns, or I'm not being disrespectful if I do that, or not understanding, because I read about this and I try to learn it. But the bottom line is, I just want to throw my arms open around everybody as soon as, you know, even within social distancing, the idea and saying, it doesn't really matter, folks. We're all part of the human race, and let's just learn to get along and help one another. And that's that hippie side of me.
Yes.
You know, I mean, I understand. I understand it's very important for people to feel respected, you know, for what they feel and what they feel about themselves and how they see themselves fitting in. I guess I'm saying I just wish it didn't matter. I wish that we had a society where people didn't have to worry about that stuff. And then we could worry about what I think are the really important things. And that is, let's treat each other with the respect that we all deserve, because we're all living, breathing, walking members of the human race on earth at this time.
The reason that it's perceived to be important, and the reason I think that it is important for some people, is, you know, a lot of millennials grew up with YouTube. And the reason I bring this up is because YouTube, especially in the early days, and very much still today, is a place where lots of people who are creating content on YouTube as a platform are sharing personal struggles and personal stories and how they overcame these things, and how they better started to understand themselves and how they dealt with it with family. And the point in all that is, millennials grow up watching this stuff, and, you know, so they realize that not everybody in their generation thinks the same, especially if you're right in a small town setting. So then it becomes, if you're one of these people, right, who doesn't fit, or who isn't well defined by what society looks at, right? Like, for example, I know some people that I went to school with that I think feel very comfortable and are very happy, males who would see themselves definitely as male, definitely as straight, who very much, you know, enjoy sports, who want to find a wife and a kid and buy a house. And they're very, all of that's very comfortable to them. Being a Republican, right? They don't feel like any of that is in contrast to who they actually are, right? So they fit. They're part of, stereotypes are true, right? Because there's some truth in, or stereotypes exist because there's some truth in them. They may not be fully true, and they might not be representative of everybody, but there are some people that fit them. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't exist in the first place. I guess what I'm getting at here is, then the people who don't feel that way almost feel the need to be very clear and get the labels defined, because it's not so much a matter of society getting them. They may claim that that's what it is. I think it has more to do with that person understanding who they are. So we do it under the veil of we want society to understand. And maybe there is some truth to that. I mean, I don't fully discount that, but I think a bigger part of it is the internal side of I need to understand. So for me to understand, I have to figure out what I think about this, right? If I say I'm male or female, or if I'm gender fluid, those are all labels. None of those are less of a label than something else.
But I guess my thing is, one, why do we have to label it all? And I understand.
Well, and that's what I
understand. Your explanation
right.
is that you're doing it for yourself. Okay. And if you're doing it for yourself, then, and here's where I'm going to ask you a question. Then why does it need to be validated by any outside source? Once I know who I am, and I understand, I get it. I get the argument that, well, because I'm part of the majority, I already get that satisfaction. But I don't see myself, and I know people would, older white male, privilege, whatever, but I've never seen myself. I've always, for the most part, swimming upstream, but I don't care whether other people validate my being. Because the only thing that's important is that I like who I am and I try to do others. So my question to you is, I understand where the self-labeling, because you have to find your niche so you're comfortable with yourself. Where's the need come from that others need to openly validate that for you then?
I think we all have that built in, at least when I say we all, talking mainly about Americans here, I guess, we all have that built in good feeling that we get when, even if we don't seek the validation, right? Or even if we don't feel like we're actively looking at it, that doesn't prevent the biological reward system of releasing the dopamine and the other feel-good hormones when other people validate you, right? And they say that they're on your side, or they say that you did a good job, or they say that they're impressed by what you do. And a lot of that depends on who it is. Like, obviously, if it's a parent telling you that, even if you had a terrible parent, right? Because we see this all the time. Kids who didn't know their parents, or who had parents that maybe weren't the best. There's still that internal struggle going on of wanting their approval, right? Because I think, and that's a society thing again. I think it's a biological thing and a societal thing. We are brought up and raised, right, we are told that you want the approval of people like your parents, people like teachers, right? People of authority. People
you respect, or people that you
right.
have held up with some kind of esteem. It means more when they tell you something.
Exactly. So I think that plays into it, and this is what's hard about all of this that we've been talking about, is the difference between the side that is how much of this is built into us as humans versus how much of this is a product of our society. Because one of those things, there's not a lot we can do to change right now. The biological side, there's not a lot that we can force there at the moment. Lance and I did a great episode a couple weeks ago, talking about the possibility of doing some serious gene editing. So maybe that's not that far off, but the other side of it is the societal side. That's absolutely something that we can change, because that takes
our brains are wired. And that's the focus of the show, is that for many of us, our brains are wired a certain way, but then you can't throw out, as you point out, you can't throw out the factor of societal norms that work hand in hand with the way our brains are wired.
So let's talk about, where do we go from here? What do we do with all this plethora of information that Lance and I have discussed? And what about the academic side of things? Some researchers have come under criticism for studying certain items like this. We're going to look at all of that and more. Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Biology, society, and how we view all of it. That's what we've talked about so far on today's episode. The difference biologically and societally between boys, girls, and how we view them and what we make of all that. What do we do with that information? Because it's not just enough to talk about the info. There is a place and a time for that, but as you all know on this show, it's about how is society acting on this data? How do these motivations and these things that we believe define us as a society, as people, what are we doing with that info? And before we talk about where do we go from here, I think this is just important to say, Lance, at the end of the Wall Street Journal article that we're referencing today, which is available at thestateofus.org. At the end of that article, it talks a little bit about that some scientists are coming under fire, some researchers are coming under fire for studying the biological differences between girls and boys, right? And this goes back to a theme that you and I have talked about before, censorship on college campuses, right? To me, it all kind of falls under the same umbrella. We cannot not research things because we're afraid of what the answers might tell us. That is, in my mind, I don't think that's a good reason to not do something. The data, for better or for worse, is good to have. And if we, regardless of what side you're on, if we all are working from the same data, even if we come to different conclusions, that is the important thing. We have to all be working, from a similar set of facts and information, because so much of what we face right now in society and so much of what the problem is that many of us are working from different, air quotes here, facts. And so having the research and having the data, I think, is better than not having it, even if it might not help our side to have that data.
I think it's really important. To me, what it says is, okay, the scientific data says there is such a thing as global warming, and it is changing the earth. We can argue to what effect and everything else, but that's happening. Many of us get upset when people deny that that's happening. Well, to me, it's just as bad to say that when we do studies of the brain, that the male brain and the female brain do different things and are wired differently. It's just as bad to deny that. If we have the scientific information that shows it, then let's accept it and let's just go on and then deal with it. And what does that mean? And what do we have to do? And so I think sometimes it's like, well, it's really easy for me to say that this is bad. But then if something comes out that's scientifically proven that goes against, like you said, your own personal argument, then, well, I'm going to just deny it and it doesn't exist. And that's wrong. If we can prove it, then let's take it and let's figure out what that means and how we can use it to benefit our society.
Well, and remember too, that this is, I think, something people forget with pretty much every scientific study, is that they're almost never, right? Never are they always. I mean, there are some instances where that is the case, like 2 + 2 = 4 type of thing. But
it is until we find out new information.
Exactly. It's
the set of facts we have currently. So we have to work from those until we get a new set of facts.
Right. Well, and the other thing is that when we're studying people, when you look at these studies, we always talk about the large numbers, right? 80% of, males XYZ, right? But remember that
means what?
Right. That there is a 20%
aren't.
Who aren't.
Right.
So if you hear this data and you're like, well, that doesn't describe me. Well, that's fine. That just means that, you're not in the portion that's being discussed.
Right.
And so I think that there's that disconnect too, that we have to be more aware of. People use these things and they throw them around and say, well, this makes, this means that I'm right and you're wrong because 80% think this. And it's like, well, no, it means that 80% think that. It's like all the people, Lance, who got, all twisted up in 2016 about, well, they said that Hillary had a 60% chance of winning, so they were wrong because she didn't win. Well, no. They said that there was a 60% chance, which means there's a 40% chance. And it just so happened, right, that it went this way this time. So I think that's because people use that to be mad at the news media, right? Like if you wanted Hillary to win, you use that. And it's like, I just can't believe, how are they so wrong? And then on the other side, they use it and say, well, you can't trust the media because, look what they said. And then it didn't happen. And it's like, yeah, but that's, polls also have a margin of error. Remember, sure. all of this stuff, almost always has, if it's of any reputable value, look at the bottom. It's got a margin of error, right? Plus or minus this many percentage points because of these types of things. You have to allow for the fact that none of it's perfect and none of it's exactly right. Because a lot of this stuff we can't just know for 100%. As Lance said, it's true until it's not. It's true until we get new data that changes what we think.
Well, and we talk about too, these academic studies. I was sharing with you before the show where years ago it was found out that females do much better in advanced math and science classes if they're not in there with young men. That's a fact. Now you can argue all the reasons why it would happen, and there was lots of supposition and everything else. But for whatever reason, young women, when they would take, algebra 2, calculus, trigonometry, chemistry, all those classes, if they took them in a room full of females, they would score much better and they would learn more and they would do better. Didn't seem to make much difference for the guys. Okay. That got a lot of backlash. Well, but it's true. I'm not saying we should change the way we educate them, but then again, to deny that information that, well, this is what happened when we did it, means you're not going to have the best discussion and the best outcome that you can come up with.
Exactly. And that's kind of what we're all about here on The State of Us, right? So what do you do with this? What do you do with all this information? Well, Lance, I think our mission statement tells you, right, exactly what you should do when we're having these types of discussions.
Right. I mean, all we're trying to do here at True Chat is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And that's what we've tried to do today. We told you up front, we're being honest, we're being open, and we hope that you agree with us that we've been respectful and that we don't have all the answers, but we have a lot of questions and we do have some answers. And if your answers don't agree with ours, then let us know and let's continue the discussion.
Exactly. And you can find all the ways to tune into the program, to engage with us, all on our website, thestateofus.org. And there are a lot of different ways to tune in because this is a podcast. It's a syndicated radio program. You can get the latest episodes of the podcast on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And Lance, part of everything we're doing, it's more effective if more people are part of these conversations. So if you're out there and you're listening, what are some of the ways, Lance, that those individuals could invite others to join this conversation?
Well, you can always find us on Stitcher, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and anywhere else that fine podcasts are found.
For The State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
And I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to our producer, Bradley Butch, and thank you all for tuning in, making this conversation happen. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.